long last, the time has come. Welcome to Hong Kong and the sequel to one of Dreamcast's greatest experiences. The game which many believed marked the end of a great franchise. This is the one and only Shenmue 2. Shenmue 2 is an important game not only for the industry at large, but also for this modest YouTube show that you're watching right now. The episode on Shenmue Chapter 1 was the very first episode of DF Retro that I completed. It was the game that helped make DF Retro possible, and so I hope that everyone who has watched that video enjoys this look at the sequel. This Eastern epic then stands as one of the most ambitious games of its time, and today we're going to celebrate those achievements, draw comparisons between the Dreamcast and Xbox iterations, and check out the best way to emulate the game today. Let's get started. Both in terms of development and plot, Shenmue 2 picks up right where the first game left off. As instructed by Master Chen in the first chapter, Ryo Hazuki departs his hometown of Yokosuka, Japan, in search of Li Xiaotao somewhere in Hong Kong. This change in scenery represents a dramatic shift both in terms of narrative and the core gameplay. Of course, if you recall, much of the earliest media made available for Shenmue depicted locations and characters set in and around Hong Kong. This was the location that had been in development from the very beginning, and as such, the creation of Shenmue 2 perhaps follows a less linear path than that of a traditional sequel. This was always part of Yu Suzuki's grand vision, even from the earliest days. This may have contributed to AM2's ability to turn around a sequel in less than 2 years. The original Shenmue was released in Japan on December 29, 1999, while Shenmue 2 made its debut on September 6, 2001. That's just 1 year and 8 months later. And while the game carries a 2 in its title, Shenmue 2 is actually comprised of chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the overall story. The second chapter was cut from the game and is instead depicted in a series of comics covering Ryo's journey aboard the ship on his way to Hong Kong. These were made available in the Xbox version of the game, and tells the story of how Ryo faced off once again against Chai, who you might remember from the first game. Ryo engages Chai once again and defeats him after he kidnapped a little girl whom Ryo saves. So the little girl and her mother you encounter at the beginning of the game then? That's her. The game proper then begins as Ryo arrives in Hong Kong. Players will follow him throughout the city up through Kowloon and eventually into rural China. More so than the original game, Shenmue 2 feels like a real journey. Those who experienced it will never forget moments such as the dramatic ascension to the top of the Yellowhead building at the end of Disc 3, or the peaceful stroll through the Chinese countryside near the end of the game. The size and scope of the world is much larger than Shenmue Chapter 1, and unlike the first chapter, it's truly possible to become lost in this world. Shenmue 2 was released before open-world games became commonplace. In that sense, there was no blueprint in place, making Yu Suzuki and his team real trailblazers in this area. The larger environments of Shenmue 2 now feature many more zones to explore, each which are larger than anything in the first chapter. Within each of these places then, there are many buildings and structures which can be entered and fully explored. That is the key difference between the first and second game's level design. A great example of this appears in the aforementioned Yellowhead building. This massive, dilapidated skyscraper in Kowloon asks the players to reach the top through a combination of exploration, combat, and quick-time events. Along the way, however, it's actually possible to stop and enter virtually every single room in this building. And this isn't the only location where this is possible. This freedom to explore, even when there is ultimately nothing useful to the player to be found, is something that remains difficult to create even today. It helps build the illusion of a real world that you're exploring here, one that's lived in. This was achieved with what Yu Suzuki refers to as the magic room system. Essentially, the development team built a series of objects that one might find in a standard room, such as tables and couches and whatnot, and added these objects to a database of sorts. The magic room algorithm then could analyze the shape and size of each room and place appropriate objects within them. The algorithm understood things such as door and window positions, which made certain that objects were placed realistically within each room. The magic weather system also returns in Shenmue 2, and this time, the game features an enhanced skybox. The cloud layer now moves more realistically than before, with additional color gradients helping to smooth over transitions between various times of day. The increase in environment size and complexity also means that texture variety had to be increased. As a result, the texture work can sometimes appear somewhat less refined than Shenmue up close, as more memory had to be dedicated to quantity over quality. If you step back and look at the big picture, however, it's evident that the game was pushing boundaries for its time. As before, Shenmue 2 is broken up into individual sections, which are each loaded separately, and we can actually take a peek at some of these scenes created for the game from a new perspective now. Thanks to the work done by Espiral over on the Shenmue Dojo forums, we actually have some of the smaller scenes available to view right now. You can make use of modern model viewing programs to examine these different sections of the game and really get an understanding of how they were built. It's really fascinating to look back on the construction of large scenes from a 15-year-old game. Now, in terms of character detail, Shenmue 2 retains the quality similar to the original game, despite the much larger environments. Of course, when the original was released, the Dreamcast was the only new console on the market, so it really stood out. But in 2001, the PlayStation 2 was already widely available around the world, and the Xbox and GameCube were on their way. The visuals and character details, while still beautiful, didn't quite stand out in the same way as a result. Still, main characters remain just as nicely detailed and attractive during the game's many cutscenes, which this time are entirely letterboxed. These dramatic scenes played out with excellent animation and camera work. While other games were starting to catch up to what Yu Suzuki and crew were doing at this time, a presentation this refined in such a large game was still ultimately pretty unheard of at the time. Of course, in many other scenes, secondary characters remain somewhat less detailed in comparison once again, with lots of simple models and relatively low-resolution textures. It doesn't look especially great, but it was a necessary sacrifice of the time. Shenmue 2 also features areas with more on-screen characters than the original, which can lead to some dramatic scenes. Pushing these additional characters around each scene, in addition to presenting overall larger environments, does present challenges for the system. Pop-in is often evident during exploration, and performance can slow to a crawl as you see here. This example does highlight one of the issues that we often ran into while playing the game. I love what AM2 is trying to do on the Dreamcast here, but certain areas just don't run very well at all. Shenmue 2 doesn't actually make use of frame skipping either, which means when the performance does dip like this, the game actually operates in slow motion. It feels as if you're walking through the mud here. This type of performance dip does tend to occur along specific streets or in certain zones, however, so it's not something you encounter throughout the entire game by any means. It is disappointing, no doubt, but at least the game always maintains proper frame pacing, so it never feels choppy per se. I also want to take a moment to mention image quality here. As with other Dreamcast games, Shenmue 2 operates at 640x480 in progressive scan, and this time I captured all of the footage using a Toro VGA box, a nice upgrade since the first Shenmue video, but as you can see though, Shenmue 2 is full of shimmering artifacts throughout. The reason here is simple: despite the incredibly busy textures, Shenmue 2 does not make use of mip maps at all. This results in significant shimmering along every surface. And just as a refresher, mip maps are basically textures generated at progressively smaller sizes designed to reduce texture aliasing and improve performance. With that in mind, look again here, and you can see that distant textures become garbled and pixelated as they extend away from the camera frustum. Now, on one hand, this is the approach that AM2 took with all of its Model 2 and Model 3 arcade games, and the Dreamcast bilinear filtering technique suffers from plenty of its own artifacts, but on the other hand, it does result in a game that can appear quite messy at times. It's certainly a curious choice. Then we move over to audio, which is another point worth bringing up. As always, the soundtrack in Shenmue 2 is a very important part of the experience, and as with the first game, Shenmue 2 utilizes the Dreamcast's Yamaha audio chip for music playback. The majority of the tracks used in the game are generated by this chip, and they do sound quite good. As before then, all characters are voiced in this release as well, but unlike the original game, the Dreamcast version only ever featured the Japanese voice acting, which sounds quite good and is how I prefer to play the game anyways.
あなたが助けてくれたの?
大丈夫か?
ありがとう.
Of course, the always industrious modding community went back and actually added the English dub that would be included with the Xbox version of the game as well, so you can play with English on the Dreamcast if you want.
He does not know of the strength hidden within him. The strength that would destroy him. The strength that would fulfill his wishes.
No thanks. So overall, from a technical perspective, Shenmue 2 is a fine game on the Dreamcast with its large complex maps and relatively detailed visuals. The presentation here is top-notch. The frame rate troubles and mediocre image quality are small blemishes on an otherwise impressive production. But of course, many North American fans of Shenmue 2 didn't actually get the chance to play the game on a Dreamcast, at least without importing.
The Xbox is everything The Rock is. Cutting edge, powerful, exhilarating, and like The Rock, it will be the most electrifying thing coming out this year.
With the development of Shenmue 2 coinciding with the death of Dreamcast, it was announced that Shenmue 2 would end up skipping Sega's last console, and instead, the rights were picked up by Microsoft for release on its brand new Xbox console. Shenmue 2 was getting a port. At the time, Sega was making some serious moves as a third-party developer, and with titles such as Jet Set Radio Future, Gun Valkyrie, Panzer Dragoon Orta, Phantasy Star Online, and Shenmue 2, the Xbox was becoming something of a spiritual successor to the Dreamcast. Of course, in the case of Shenmue 2, the Xbox version was published by Microsoft Game Studios, which helped fund its development for the new system. Shenmue 2 would be released on the Xbox on October 28, 2002, more than a year after its first appearance on Dreamcast. Now, in order to get Xbox fans up to speed on Shenmue, the game actually shipped with a DVD movie entitled Shenmue the Movie. This 90-minute film included cutscenes from the original game presented in a linear fashion designed to tell the story of the first chapter. While this disc was included with the Xbox release, in order to bring newcomers up to speed, it wasn't the only appearance. Shenmue the Movie actually appeared in select Japanese theaters in early 2001 while being released on DVD later that year. It was a strange time indeed. As you can imagine then, the game was ported to Xbox in a relatively short period of time. Thankfully, the Xbox was easy enough to work with, making this port possible within the allotted time. I can imagine that any attempts to port Shenmue 2 over to, say, the PlayStation 2 instead would have required significantly more time and money due to architectural differences. While most of the core visual design remains the same, there is a laundry list of differences between the Xbox and Dreamcast versions of Shenmue 2. Let's take a closer look. The first thing that stands out is image quality. Shenmue 2 makes use of Quincunk's anti-aliasing on the Xbox, which results in a much softer looking game overall. Edges are cleaner than what we saw on Dreamcast, and shimmering is reduced significantly. That said, in this case, I'm using the official Xbox component cables for capture, while Dreamcast is using the aforementioned Toro VGA box, which produces cleaner output than what you can achieve on the Xbox. So while the game is cleaner, the capture quality of Dreamcast is superior here. Textures are also treated differently on the Xbox, with many surfaces now employing MIP mapping with trilinear texture filtering. This has a pretty significant impact on image quality and motion and helps avoid the severe shimmering and pixelization we see on the Dreamcast. By and large, the textures used throughout the game appear virtually identical, but there are certain textures such as Ryo's jacket, which were updated with higher quality artwork. Shenmue 2 also more prominently features bodies of water across its environment, especially here at the beginning, and the Xbox version is a massive improvement in this department, as you can see. A higher quality animated surface texture is used for water throughout the game, and it's more convincing in motion than what we saw on the Dreamcast. Definitely a nice improvement. Of course, perhaps the most noticeable and controversial change to the visuals is the addition of bloom lighting. With access to the more powerful Xbox hardware, but a limited amount of development time, AM2 clearly wanted to take advantage of hardware features like this to improve the visuals. Bloom lighting is one of those key differences. During the day, the bloom lighting gives the world sort of a hazy look, as opposed to the sharp but sometimes garish look of the Dreamcast game. I think it looks pretty good in many scenes, but at the same time it can also appear rather overdone in others, making some characters look as if they're glowing. Once the sun sets, however, the benefits become clear, as the reliance on neon signs and bright lights work perfectly with this new bloom effect. Running around the city at night feels like a significant improvement on the Xbox here, for the most part at least. Overall, I'm a fan of the bloom lighting, but at the same time I can still appreciate the look of the original game on Dreamcast. From a development perspective, it was likely an easy feature to implement, and it helps differentiate the two versions. There have also been some slight changes to models in the game. While Shenmue 2 looks predominantly the same in terms of geometric detail, I did notice some subtle changes. During the introduction, for instance, the ship here receives a nice boost in detail on the Xbox. Then as you step off the boat later, it's also possible to note a few extra triangles in Ryo's shoes. These are the types of changes you'll see at various points throughout the game. Minor tweaks and changes designed to smooth out the overall visuals. Of course, you would probably never even notice these improvements without seeing the game side by side, but there you go. The Xbox version also features major changes to the way shadows are handled. The Dreamcast version works much like the original game, but on Xbox we see what appears to be stencil shadows used for characters and buildings. That's right, the environment now has its own shadows, which can be cast onto characters in real time. The shadows are relatively simple, but do bring an extra dimension to the presentation. Of course, in other scenes, being hidden in shadow means that you won't see the player's shadow either, and that can give a false impression that the Dreamcast version features additional shadows overall. It's certainly an interesting change. But then we come to the motion blur. While I normally love modern per-pixel motion blur, this basic accumulation blur here, used on the Xbox during battle sequences, doesn't really sit well with me. Every battle turns into a blur fest on the Xbox with visible trails following behind each character. It's a strange choice that looks somewhat out of place next to the rest of the game. Of course, other Xbox features were also put to use in different areas. The black and white buttons on the Xbox controller both receive special functionality, for instance. Press the white button and you can cycle between a number of different visual filters. It's an interesting idea, no doubt, and it's also likely easy to implement, I'm sure, but I kinda prefer the original look. The black button then lets you take a screenshot of the game at any point and save it off to your hard drive. The advantages of a hard drive were a big selling point at the time, so it made sense to use this option. And in fact, the hard drive is also beneficial in that it lets you keep as many saves as you want of the game, which is great. But then we come to performance, which is where the Xbox version really shines. Loading is significantly faster here when transitioning between areas. This helps make exploration a much more enjoyable experience on the Xbox, as players are asked to run between various districts. On Dreamcast, I often found myself avoiding random shops on the street, as the loading times required to enter the shops didn't seem to be worth the wait. But on Xbox, experimentation feels a lot more pleasant. Then there is the frame rate, and again the Xbox version offers up a much faster, more consistent level of performance throughout the game. Using this same city sequence from earlier, we can see that Xbox has little trouble hitting 30 frames per second. This scene also highlights the aforementioned issue on Dreamcast where the game doesn't drop frames while under load and instead draws all of them no matter how long it takes to complete each frame. It simply runs in slow motion here, requiring more time to reach the end of this area. This of course should be no real surprise though, considering the jump in hardware the Xbox offers, and it is a nice bonus. The Xbox version also supports Dolby Digital 5.1 for select cutscenes, though from my time with the game most of it still appeared to be pretty much in stereo. More than anything else, however, the most significant change here is the addition of an English language voice track.
Watch where you're going, you punk!
That goes for you too, barging into people like that.
You must be Japanese.
Yes.
Watch out! Here in Hong Kong, you can easily get run over.
I wasn't a huge fan of the original Shenmue dub, and I feel like Shenmue 2 is actually a lot worse in this department.
When he is ready, he shall seek me out, and we shall brave together the rocky path.
The very literal script can often sound somewhat awkward, and many of the voice actors just don't sound very natural at all. Ryo himself certainly has his charms, but many of the other characters fall incredibly flat. Thankfully, just as on the Dreamcast, modders have made it possible to inject the Japanese voice acting right back into the Xbox version of the game.
Over here.
Are you talking to me?
お主、憲法をやっとるな。
ええ、多少は。
見たところ、少林寺の流れを組んでおるな。
Something you can do using a modded console. Thank goodness for the modding community. Overall, despite some of the changes, or in fact because of, the Xbox version of Shenmue 2 is a great way to replay the game, especially if you can mod in the Japanese voice acting. The faster performance, improved image quality, and other improvements there do outweigh some of the issues with the overdone bloom lighting and the motion blur during combat. It's also a much cheaper way to experience Shenmue 2 today, since both the Japanese and European versions of the Dreamcast game go for quite a bit these days. But of course, there are additional ways to enjoy Shenmue 2 in the modern era. There are currently basically two ways to emulate Shenmue 2. You can use a Dreamcast emulator to play the original version on a PC or another supported device, or you can go with the Xbox 360, which itself can emulate the Xbox version. So let's start with the 360 emulation of the Xbox version then. Unlike many games supported on Xbox 360, Shenmue 2 actually runs pretty well. There is definitely some additional slowdown here and there, of course, but it's not too bad, and it winds up feeling more like the Dreamcast version in that regard. But what's interesting in this version, however, is the inaccuracies in the emulation. Many of the visual effects added to the Xbox version originally simply do not work at all on Xbox 360. The stencil shadows, for instance, are completely broken here. None of the buildings or characters in the game world have shadows anymore, resulting in a world that looks somewhat plain in comparison. Whether they were intentionally disabled due to problems or simply don't work, it is something interesting to see. But then we have all of the post-processing effects. None of these effects work on Xbox 360. Some of these removed effects can have a positive impact on the game, while others are certainly missed. Bloom lighting, for instance, is completely disabled here, which can work in the favor of some scenes, but ultimately robs the game of its original Xbox look, especially at night. Motion blur is another one. During battles, motion blur is disabled when running on 360, which I actually feel is a benefit here since I never really liked the look of it as I mentioned earlier. But still, it's another inaccuracy to consider when looking at this version of the game. Also, the filters that you could toggle by using the white button no longer work at all and simply cause the game to pause momentarily when you press the button, as you see here. I haven't actually had as much time to play the game on Xbox 360 at this point, so it's very likely that there are other bugs in here. For instance, I understand that the arcade minigames such as Hang On no longer work on 360 and simply cause the game to crash, which is why I'm not so sure that this is a great way to play Shenmue 2 anymore. It's neat that it works as well as it does, but between all of the missing visual effects and all of the potential for bugs, it's probably best if you stick with the original Xbox hardware if you want to play this version of the game. So what about PC emulation then? Well, the last time I looked at Shenmue, I focused on Null DC, but since then, I've taken a real shine to the best Dreamcast emulator available right now. Welcome to the world of Demule, the most accurate Dreamcast and Naomi emulator in existence. Beyond simply enjoying Shenmue 2, Demule opens up a world of Sega, the likes of which was hidden from the home market for years. Not only can you enjoy Dreamcast titles using this emulator, it also supports other platforms such as Naomi 2, the powerful arcade board designed to run Virtua Fighter 4. You can now enjoy VF4 at full speed on a modern PC with accurate visuals and responsive controls. It's a great way to preserve the original experience that exceeds what was possible in the PlayStation 2 home port of the game. Or how about Sega's Hikaru board, which powered such games as Planet Harriers, an interesting arcade shooter which never received a home port. Emulation is really the only way to experience the game today, and hence the only way to preserve it. Demule even supports alternatives such as the Atomiswave board, which powered a number of games, including the run-and-gun Dolphin Blue, a game released by Sammy which credits at least one of the staff members from Nazca, the studio responsible for Metal Slug. On a real Atomiswave board, Dolphin Blue chugs pretty hard, but Demule was able to power right through it. Which brings us to Shenmue. Just how does Demule run Shenmue 2? Well, as you'd expect then, it looks and runs quite well. Demule does require a very powerful PC, no doubt, but if you're using a modern gaming system, this really shouldn't be an issue at all. The emulation is accurate enough and looks very similar to a Dreamcast running with a VGA box. This, of course, is with the DX11 hardware plugin, the most accurate of the bunch. There are some hitches though when data is fetched, and the DX11 hardware plugin is limited to native resolution of the game, but overall it's solid. But what really makes this interesting, however, is what happens when you pair the emulator with something like Reshade. With Reshade 3.0, for instance, you can use one of the other DX11 plugins or DX10 plugins and customize your Shenmue experience with all of the benefits that you'd expect. While I enjoy basic adjustments to the game, such as changing the way the colors are mapped, maybe adding a little film grain and the like, it's actually possible to take things much further and come up with some really neat results. If you go with an older version of Reshade and stick with the DX10 plugin with Demule, you can actually push these visuals really far, though it too can introduce some problems. So where do you get started then? Well, I would actually recommend heading on over to the Shenmue Dojo forums. The posters over there have spent an incredible amount of time perfecting the Shenmue experience, and between that and the Demule website, that should be enough to get you started. Now, personally, I prefer to stick with original hardware for these things, but I think emulation is a really great way to preserve classic games like this. These discs are not going to be around forever, and having the data available and playable on a PC is important, I think. Following the release of Shenmue 2, AM2 continued to produce games, but it became increasingly clear that Shenmue may never be finished. In 2004, Shenmue Online was announced as a partnership between Sega and JC Entertainment. News and information persisted for years around this project, but it was clear that the project was always in turmoil. There were trailers released, as you can see here, but most fans of Shenmue knew that this would never fill the hole left by the ending of the second game. so it was no surprise when Shenmue Online was quietly cancelled sometime in 2007, and has remained out of the public eye ever since. I think that's probably for the better. Of course, communities continued to thrive for years over Shenmue. The game had developed a huge fan base that loved and continued to play the original games. But in 2011, Yu Suzuki would eventually leave Sega behind. Shenmue 3 was something that was talked about for years, but really, nobody truly believed it could ever happen. That is, until one fateful conference in 2015.
出張に行ってもどこ行っても、3はどうなった、3はどうなった、いつ3出るんだとか可能性を探ってきた結果、キックスターターでシェンムー3を作ることに決めました。
Shenmue 3 was announced at E3 2015 on stage at the Sony press conference. It was a moment fans of the game would never forget. Even amidst concerns over the Kickstarter nature of the project, this was the first time in more than a decade that Shenmue fans finally had something to look forward to. So where will it go from here? We can't really say for sure, of course, but I wish Mr. Suzuki and his team the absolute best and hold out hope that Shenmue will live again. But with that, we've come to the end of the longest episode of DF Retro to date. I hope you found something interesting in this reflection back on AM2's classic title. I also want to take a moment to thank everyone for supporting DF Retro this year and helping to make it a series worth continuing. The episode on Shenmue was the very first to cross the 100,000 view barrier, and with any luck, this video will follow behind in due time. But in the meantime, if you've been away from Shenmue for a while or perhaps have yet to actually play the games, there is no better time to jump in than this holiday season. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.